This is the West Wall, the Atlantic Wall. It had taken German engineers 4 years to design, and hundreds of thousands of enslaved workers from all over Europe 4 years to build. Hitler and Rommel, who was so soon to die, had boasted that no Allied army would be able to maintain itself on European soil for more than 9 hours. But even as the Nazis boasted, so the Allied leaders made their plans. And they chose the coast of Normandy for their landing ground. In the early hours of June the 6th, 1944, planes of British and American airborne divisions took off for France, while in the channel below sailed the ships carrying the men of the 21st Army Group who had been chosen for the assault. Already Allied heavy bombers were battering down the German defenses. And the guns of the Navy were tearing gaps into the steel and concrete walls of Fortress Europe. For the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, and for Admiral Ramsay in command of the Allied fleet, these were anxious hours. The great machine had been set in motion. It must not stop. To build it, free men and women all over the world had sweated and strained, and they had put their trust in it. And also on it rested the hopes of the peoples of occupied Europe. But these men from New York, Chicago, or Tennessee were confident. So were their comrades from London, Glasgow, or Kent. And among the British were many who had bitter memories of 1940, of Dunkirk, of a dead brother, or of a friend. Courcelles, Saint-Aubin, Langrune, Ouistreham, Port-en-Bessin, Saint-Vaast, Arromanches. Remember these names. For there the fate of civilization was being settled between man and man, machine and machine, in the shallow ditches and the muddy sea. While Allied supplies were being rushed to Normandy, another battle was going on behind the German lines. Planes of the Allied air forces were destroying the railways, the roads, and the bridges over which the German reinforcements would have to pass. These Germans were waiting for reinforcements, which were said to be on their way. They waited in vain. Allied reinforcements kept coming all the time. June the 6th, June the 7th, June the 8th, June the 9th. Every day, fresh troops poured through the twisted ruins of the West Wall. The Battle of the Beaches has been won, said General Montgomery on June the 11th. Already the British had taken Bayeux. The Americans, to the west, were pushing on toward Carentan. The first phase was over. From now on, the Allies would continue to advance. All along the outer rim of the Allied bridgehead, bitter fighting went on. Flail tanks were beating paths through the hidden minefields. And behind the shelling came soldiers in twos and threes, in platoons and companies, plodding forward in battalions, making prisoners here, going forward again. Taking more prisoners. Street fighting, taking a village, rounding up more prisoners. Going forward in brigades, becoming divisions, and part of something immeasurable, the offensive. As the Germans retreated, they left behind them chaos and ruin. To speed the advance, Allied soldiers, with the help of French civilians, began to repair the broken railway lines. Sappers began to clear the streets of wrecked villages and towns. The Allies tried to restore life as quickly as possible to all those communities which had suffered in the battle. At the same time, they set about remaking the shell-pitted roads to speed supplies to the front. And they laid down airstrips in the open fields to provide Allied soldiers with fighter cover and protection. June the 12th, June the 13th, British and Canadian troops began to push a wedge-shaped salient eastward toward the city of Caen. German resistance was growing stiffer. It was in this area that the German commander hoped to wear down the British armor. This calculation gave the Americans their chance. From the Carentan estuary, they struck a double blow, one across the neck of the peninsula and the other toward the great port of Cherbourg. June the 16th, June the 17th, the plan that General Bradley had drawn up on his maps was being fought out in the fields and villages. June the 18th, the Americans in Banville, the peninsula cut in two. The second thrust was also going well. By June the 24th, General Bradley and his men were on the outskirts of the city of Cherbourg. By June the 25th, they were fighting in the streets. Behind every corner was a German tank. And in every house there were German snipers. The enemy commander had given his word that the city would be defended to the last man and the last bullet. But like Field Marshal Paulus at Stalingrad, von Schlieben preferred to keep his skin rather than his word. He surrendered, and where he led them, his troops followed. On June the 26th, Cherbourg was set free. Cherbourg, second only to Marseilles as a port. Mr. Churchill visited the city soon after its liberation. He inspected the launching sites the Germans had erected there for their secret weapons against England. One of the last acts of the German garrison had been to destroy the harbour installations of Cherbourg, so as to deny them to the Allies. The Germans knew that the Allies must have the use of a first-class port to bring ashore all the tanks, the lorries and guns, ammunition and stores a modern army needs. The Allies, therefore, began to repair the wrecked wharves with great determination. For this important task, French workers volunteered at once. The Germans knew that if they could prevent the Allies from seizing and putting into working order any great port, they could defeat the invasion. But the Allies had foreseen this. They had constructed floating harbours in England, and they towed them across the channel in sections. The huge concrete piers were sunk into position to form a breakwater, and more than 60 ships were sunk in line to make an outer wall. Great floating piers and wharves that rose and fell with the tide were set up. Soon, lorries and tanks were rolling down toward the beaches in ever greater numbers. Out at the front, every vehicle was needed desperately, urgently, immediately. Behind the lines in Cherbourg, life was slowly going back to normal. There was food again in the marketplace, and gossip and argument about the latest news. There were newspapers again, written and printed by Frenchmen who again were free. And moreover, for the first time in 4 years, French men and women were free to celebrate the 14th of July. Old soldiers of the last war saw American soldiers and French sailors marching shoulder to shoulder in this, a symbol of the friendship between the United Nations that must continue when peace comes. While the men of General Bradley's armies were clearing the tip of the Cherbourg Peninsula, British and Canadian troops of the Second Army began a great offensive on the eastern flank of the bridgehead. It was in the area of Caen that the Germans had concentrated the greater part of their armour. Caen, therefore, became the pivot of the Allied offensive. The British would attack first, near Tilly-sur-Selle. They would cut the road between Caen and Caumont. Simultaneously, the Canadians would move to the north of Caen. They would encircle Caen from the south and secure their flank by a thrust to Troarn. The conception that you land on the beaches and get a little bridgehead and then dig in, this is no good, said General Montgomery in his order of the day. You must penetrate deeply and quickly. On the 25th of June, therefore, the British attacked to the east of Tilly-sur-Selle. They succeeded in crossing the railway between Caen and Villers-Bocage at Moor. By the 27th of June, they had crossed the river Odon and made secure their bridgehead on the other side. For the next week, the Germans counterattacked with great violence. No less than 7 panzer divisions, including an elite panzer corps transferred from the Russian front, were arranged against the British and Canadians on this narrow sector. Here was the real center of the German strategic dispositions. As the struggle grew fiercer, British bombers came over to scatter and break the German tanks. After the bombardment, the Canadians went forward again. Then they came within sight of Caen itself. Although it had now begun to rain heavily, so that the free movement of the troops was impeded, the advance went on. Bulldozers shifted the mud from the road face. By the 8th of July, there was street fighting in Caen. And on the 9th, Caen was set free. The goal that General Montgomery had set his men had been won. An ancient Norman town had been freed and a great port of France. In the course of the fighting, a great part of the city of Caen had been destroyed. Many homes had been broken and gutted by the unaccountable fury of the battle. Those citizens who had sought refuge in the nearby villages now began to return to what was left of their city. Others had found sanctuary in the cathedral. Men and women of the resistance movement saw to it that food and shelter were provided. One thing was now certain. The Germans had been driven out, and the French resistance fighters, together with the British and Canadians, would make sure that the Germans would never return. But already the enemy was massing for a counter-blow. Again and again they threw themselves against the British positions. These German attacks came to nothing. By July the 18th, General Dempsey's troops were on the move again. After a heavy night barrage, they went forward. They attacked with flamethrowers of the latest type. Bridgeheads were made secure over the Orne as far as Troan. The real meaning of these attacks was made clear by Mr. Stimson, the United States Secretary of War. He said that the British and Canadians had so engaged the enemy that Rommel had no uncommitted strength with which to threaten the American corridor. As the Second Army drove the Germans back in the Caen sector, the Germans launched their flying bombs against the towns and villages of southern England, above all against London. These robots, the Nazis promised the German people, would break the will to fight of the men and women of Britain. The flying bombs destroyed 23,000 homes and damaged 1 million more. But, as in 1940, the people of London resolved not to give in. Mothers and children were sent away out of reach of the flying bombs. Special defences were set up in southern England. Heavy bombers blasted the launching sites along the Pas-de-Calais. Anti-aircraft batteries shot down the robots by the hundred. Balloons brought them down by the score. Tempest fighters demolished them. The Germans had hoped to lure the Allies into diverting troops for an attack on the heavily fortified coastline of the Pas-de-Calais in order to destroy the flying bomb bases. But the Allied commanders stuck to their own plan. Even though they hated the robot bombs and were frightened of them, the people of London hung on. More than 5,000 people were killed by the bombs. and more than 16,000 were wounded during the 80 days of terror. The Allied advance in Normandy went on rapidly and ruthlessly. British soldiers fought more fiercely than ever to end this new threat to their wives and children at home. Once more the Germans were beaten by the courage of ordinary men and women. Meanwhile, the Americans turned south from Cherbourg to occupy La Haye-Depuis. After heavy fighting, they advanced to Saint-Lô, an important road junction. Next, they swung toward Coutances. While in a double drive, General Patton's army reached Granville and Avranches. The first sweep took the Americans through wooded country in the direction of La Haye-Depuis. On July the 9th, the same day the British and Canadians had freed Caen, they entered the town. Within the next week, they overcame stubborn German resistance. By this time, there were signs that the German commander was no longer master of his own decisions. Even so, the Germans fought with the courage of despair. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Nevertheless, the Americans battered their way through to Saint-Lô by July the 16th. Before the town was finally taken, there was heavy street fighting. Thanks to the FFI, the Americans were soon able to hunt down the German snipers. The people sit and wait. Many of the older ones have sons still in German hands. While General Bradley's troops were fighting for Saint-Lô, General Patton's 3rd American Army was secretly being assembled for attack. The enemy did not suspect that Bradley's thrust to Coutances was designed to hold the German forces while Patton raced on to Avranches and Granville. General Bradley's forces took Coutances on the 28th of July. The Germans had been deceived. Patton's armored columns ran through and reached Granville and Avranches on July the 31st. The German plan to seal off the peninsula from the rest of France had failed. The taking of Avranches marks the real turning point of the Normandy campaign. From now on, the Americans were able to keep the Germans on the move. But the Germans had not enough reserves for this mobile warfare. From now on, they had to retreat. At the base of the peninsula, the American forces divided. Some cut off to Brest, while others sealed up Lorient. But the main column turned southeast and captured Rennes. On the 3rd of August, the Americans entered Rennes. How long the people of Rennes had waited, hoped, and prepared for this day. How anxiously they had followed the course of the battle, and now the day of liberation had come. At the same time, the armed forces of fighting France landed on French soil. After 4 years of unequal struggle, the people of France had an army once more, the men and women of the FFI, and the men of General Leclerc's armored division. and this was the welcome the people of one village gave them. Meanwhile, General Patton's army swept on to Laval. 3 days later, they were in Le Mans. They cleared the Germans out of Laval on August the 7th. The Germans were now desperate. They launched their counterattack at Mortain. Contrary to all his textbook instructions, the German commander threw in his forces long before the American attacks could have spent themselves. He set everything on one chance. He attacked at our weakest point, between Mortain and Avranches, to cut off the American forces from their supplies. 4 German panzer divisions were thrown into this attack. There now developed a battle unique in history, for the Allied commanders decided not to detach any tanks from General Patton's army to deal with the German counterattack, but to destroy it with rocket-firing Typhoons. It was a battle between tanks and planes. On the first day alone, our Typhoons destroyed over 80 German tanks. After 2 days of battle, the Germans withdrew on August the 9th. The American tanks swept on. One force swung southeast to the River Loire. Angers was set free on the 12th of August. Nantes was freed on August the 13th. The whole harbour was blocked with sunk and damaged ships. The task of reconstruction would be hard. Other American troops fanned out in the direction of Le Mans, Vendôme, Blois, and Orléans. A new offensive by the 2nd British and 1st Canadian armies, which included Polish, Dutch, and Belgian units, was timed to coincide with the great American breakout of the Cherbourg Peninsula. A Russian military mission came to see the crushing of the Germans in the West. The British and Americans, as they advanced in France, knew that their comrades of the Red Army were fighting on the very frontier of East Prussia. They knew that the Russians had reached the boundaries of Czechoslovakia and were already pressing into Romania. They also knew that their comrades of the 8th British and 5th American armies were spreading out beyond Rome and were driving the Germans steadily to the north of Italy. Thus, from all sides, from the west, from the south, from the east, the Allies were pressing closer and closer to Germany. It was with abounding confidence then that the Allies fought in Normandy. Confidence in themselves, in their weapons, and in the plan which their commanders had worked out with so much thought and care. This plan aimed at nothing less than the encirclement and complete destruction of the entire German 7th Army. The British were to advance to the river Vire. The Canadians were to attack down the Falaise Road. The Americans would thrust up from Le Mans to Argenton. Next, the British were to go forward to link up with the Americans near Argenton. The Belgians and Dutch would advance here, and the Americans and the French in this direction to meet the Poles and close the trap. The first phase of the attack began on August the 1st by a famous British Guards regiment. At this decisive moment, General Eisenhower said there existed a fleeting but definite opportunity for a major Allied victory. Next, the Canadians pushed down the Falaise Road. Hundreds upon hundreds of tanks moved up for the attack. Simultaneously, the Americans forged ahead from Alençon, while the Belgians with the Dutch closed in, together with the fighting French, until at last the Poles and the Americans sprang the trap on the 19th of August. The good plan had succeeded. The 7th German Army was herded together into a small area from which there was no escape. Those Germans who did not surrender were killed. The others marched off to prison camps. In all, 92,000 prisoners were taken between the 10th and the 25th of August. At this moment, there came the great news that another Allied army had landed in the south of France, about the mouth of the river Rhone. Glider troops were landed at many points. As the Allied soldiers went ashore, there was only slight opposition. The news of the defeat of the 7th Army had utterly demoralized the Germans in the south of France, who seemed only too willing to surrender. Back in Normandy, the Allied advance continued without pause. American forces freed Orléans, 74 kilometers from Paris. From Orléans, they drove southeast toward the Seine. They crossed it above Paris in the neighborhood of Melun. It was this crossing which, together with a British bridgehead north of Paris, at Mantes, made the capital untenable for the Germans. They were now forced to withdraw all along the front. The streets of Paris lay empty in the light of early morning. But behind the quiet house fronts, the men and women of the FFI were receiving their zero-hour instructions. Once more the call went out, citizens to the barricades. The trees and the streets, the very stones of Paris, helped to rid the city of the Germans. Young and old, men and women, worked feverishly to fortify their town. The flying squads of the FFI seized the Ile de la Cité. At the same time, the police joined the fight against the Germans. Presently, smashed German tanks began to litter the streets. The citizens of Paris brought out their hidden arms. Mechanics, bakers, bookbinders, shopkeepers, clerks, men and women of all classes, of all ages, all professions, united in a common effort to throw the Germans out of the city. The highest praise must go to the men and women of the Red Cross services. They went about the streets helping the wounded in the gutters and back alleys. Soon, German prisoners were being brought in from all over the city. Others were still trying to escape, but from the windows the men of the FFI hurled their bombs. Germans, slinking away to hide, were caught in a storm of bullets from the housetops. Their very arms helped to strengthen the fighters on the barricades. And so, after 8 days of struggle, Paris was set free. The terrible days of 1940, the degradation of years of occupation, were almost forgotten as the tricolour rose once more over the roofs of Paris. From all sides, from Orléans in the south, from Chartres, from Dreux further north, the victorious Allied armies were closing in on the capital. Soon they raced through the suburbs, through the Bois de Boulogne, and now the first Allied soldiers were in the very heart of Paris. Few of us who are there will forget these scenes which you are seeing now. Yet the liberation of Paris was by no means complete. German snipers and desperate fascists were still holding out in flats and schools, offices all over Paris. But they were being rounded up methodically. Soon after came General de Gaulle, the man who had for years stood for a France unbroken by defeat in battle, a France unbowed by the elaborate humiliations of the armistice. General de Gaulle. His entry into Paris was the symbol of the reunion of Frenchmen who had fought the Germans at the side of Britain and America, in Africa, in Tunisia, with Frenchmen who had carried on the struggle in the woods of France, in the inaccessible mountains, in the factories and the marshalling yards. At this great hour in the history of France, the Germans tried to assassinate General de Gaulle. From the tops of nearby houses, they fired at him as he got into his car. Machine guns from tanks returned the fire, while the crowd scattered and ran for shelter. But it was over in a few minutes. Then at last, after 4 dark, hateful years of oppression, the French took possession of their city again. Laughing and crying, they linked arms with their allies and crowded through the boulevards. Paris was free.